What is better, a happy life or a meaningful one? Eon essays. Parents often say, I want my children to be happy. It's unusual to hear, I just want my children's lives to be meaningful, yet that's what most of us seem to want for ourselves. We fear meaninglessness. We fret about the nihilism of this or that aspect of our culture. When we lose a sense of meaning, we get depressed. What is this thing we call meaning, and why might we need it so badly? Let's start with the last question. To be sure, happiness and meaningfulness frequently overlap. Perhaps some degree of meaning is a prerequisite for happiness, a necessary but insufficient condition. If that were the case, people might pursue meaning for purely instrumental reasons, as a step on the road towards happiness. But then, is there any reason to want meaning for its own sake? And if there isn't, why would people ever choose lives that are more meaningful than happy, as they sometimes do? The difference between meaningfulness and happiness was the focus of an investigation I worked on with my fellow social psychologists Kathleen, Jennifer Aker, and Emily Garbinsky, published in the Journal of Positive Psychology this August. We carried out a survey of nearly 400 U.S. citizens, ranging in age from 18 to 78. The survey posed questions about the extent to which people thought their lives were happy and the extent to which they thought they were meaningful. We did not supply a definite happiness or meaning, so our subjects responded using their own understanding of those words. By asking a large number of other questions, we were able to see which factors went with happiness and which went with meaninglessness. As you might expect, the two states turned out to overlap substantially. Almost half of the variation in meaningfulness was explained by happiness, and vice versa. Nevertheless, using statistical controls, we were able to tease two apart, isolating the pure effects of each one that were not based on the other. We narrowed our search to look for factors that had opposite effects on happiness and meaning, or at least, factors that had a positive correlation with one and not even a hint of a positive relation with the other. Negative or zero correlations were fine. Using this method, we found five major differences between happiness and meaningfulness, five areas where different versions of the good life parted company. The first had to do with getting what you wanted in. Not surprisingly, satisfaction of desires was a reliable source of happiness. But it had nothing, maybe even less than nothing, to add to a sense of meaning. People are happier to the extent that they find their lives easy rather than difficult. Happy people say they have enough money to buy the things they want and the things they need. Good health is a factor that contributes to happiness but meaningfulness. Healthy people are happier than sick people, but the lives of sick people do not lack meaning. The more often people feel good, a feeling that can arise from getting what one wants or needs, the happier they are. The less often they feel, the happier they are. But the frequency of good and bad feelings turns out to be irrelevant to meaning, which can flourish even in very forbidding conditions. The second set of differences involve time frame. Meaning and happiness are apparently experienced quite differently. Happiness is about the present. Meaning is about the future, or, more precisely, about linking past, present, and future. The more time people spend thinking about the future or the past, the more meaningful, and less happy, their lives were. Time spent imagining the future was linked especially strongly to higher meaningfulness and lower happiness, as was worry, which I'll come to later. Conversely, the more time people spend thinking about the here and now, the happier they were. Misery is often focused on the present, too, but people are happy more often than they are miserable. If you want to maximize your happiness, it looks like good advice to focus on the present, especially needs of being satisfied. Meaning, on the other hand, seems to come fumbling past, present, and future into some kind of coherent story. This begins to suggest a theory why it is we care so much about meaning. Perhaps the idea is to make happiness last. Happiness seems present focused and fleeting, whereas meaning extends into the future and the past and looks fairly stable. For this reason, people might think that for some meaningful life helps them to stay happy in the long run. They might even be right, though, in empirical fact, happiness is often fairly consistent over time. Those of us who are happy today are also likely to be happy months or even years from now, and those who are unhappy about something today commonly turn out to be unhappy about other things in the distant future. It feels as though happiness comes from outside, but the weight of evidence suggests that a big part of it comes from inside. Despite these realities, people experience happiness as something that is felt here and now, and that cannot be counted on to last. By contrast, meaning is seen as lasting, and so people think they can establish a basis for a more lasting kind of happiness by cultivating meaning. Social life was the locus of our third set of differences. As you might expect, connections to other people turned out to be important both for meaning and for happiness. Being alone in the world is linked to low levels of happiness and meaningfulness, as is feeling lonely. Nevertheless, it was the particular character of one's social connections that determined which state they helped to bring about. Simply put, meaningfulness comes from contributing to other people, whereas happiness comes from what they contribute to. This runs counter to some conventional wisdom. It is widely assumed that helping other people make happy. Well, to the extent that it does, the effect depends entirely on the overlap between meaning and happiness. Helping others had a big positive contribution to meaningfulness independent of happiness, but there was no sign that it boosted happiness independently of meaning. If anything, the effect was in the opposite direction. Once we correct for the boost to meaning, helping others can actually detract from one's own happiness. We found echoes of this phenomenon when we asked our subjects how much time they spend taking care of children. For non-parents, child care contributed nothing to happiness or meaningfulness. Taking care of other people's children is apparently neither very pleasant nor very unpleasant, and it doesn't feel meaningful either. For parents, on the other hand, caring for children was a substantial source of meaning, though it still seemed irrelevant to happiness, probably because children are sometimes delightful and sometimes slow and annoying, so it balances out. Our survey had people rate themselves as givers or as takers. Regarding oneself as a giving person strongly predicted more meaningfulness and less happiness. The effects for being a taker were weaker, possibly because people are reluctant to admit that they are takers. Even so, it was fairly clear that being a taker, or at least considering oneself to be one, boosted happiness but reduced meaning. The depth of social ties can also make a difference in how social life contributes to happiness and meaning. Spending time with friends was linked to higher happiness, but it was irrelevant to meaning. Having a few beers with buddies or enjoying a nice lunch conversation with friends might be a source of pleasure, but, on the whole, it appears not to be very important to a meaningful life. By comparison, spending more time with loved ones was linked to higher meaning and was irrelevant to happiness. The difference, presumably, is in the depth of the relationship. Time with friends is often devoted to simple pleasures, without much at stake, so it may foster good feelings while doing little to increase meaning. If your friends are grumpy or tiresome, you can just move on. Time with loved ones is not so uniformly pleasant. Sometimes one has to pay bills, deal with illnesses or repairs, and do other unsatisfying chores. And of course, loved ones can be difficult too, in which case you generally have to work on the relationship and hash it out. It is probably no coincidence that arguing was itself associated with more meaning and less happiness. If happiness is about getting what you want, it appears that fullness is about doing things that express yourself. A fourth category of differences had to do with struggles, problems, stresses, and the like. In general, these went with lower happiness and higher meaningfulness. We asked how many positive and negative events people had recently experienced. Having good things happen turned out to be helpful for both meaning and happiness. No surprise there. But bad things were a different story. Highly meaningful lives encounter plenty of negative events, which of course reduce happiness. Indeed, stress and negative life events were two powerful blows to happiness, despite their significant positive association with a meaningful life. We begin to get a sense of what the happy but not very meaningful life would be like. Stress, problems, worrying, arguing, reflecting on challenges and struggles, all these are notably low or absent from the lives of purely happy people, but they seem to be part and parcel of a highly meaningful life. The transition to retirement illustrates this difference. With the cessation of work demands and stresses, happiness goes up but meaningfulness drops. Do people go out looking for stress or to add meaning to their lives? It seems more likely that they seek meaning by pursuing projects that are difficult and uncertain. One tries to accomplish things in the world. This brings both ups and downs, so the net gain to happiness might be small, but the process contributes to meaningfulness either way. To use an example close to home, conducting research adds immensely to the sense of a meaningful life. What could be meaningful than working to increase the store of human knowledge? But projects rarely go exactly as planned, and the many failures and frustrations along the way can suck some of the joy out of the process. The final category of differences had to do with self and personal identity. Activities that express the self are an important source of meaning but are mostly irrelevant to happiness. Of the 37 items on our list that asked people to rate whether some activity, such as exercising or meditating, was an expression or reflection of the self, 25 yielded significant positive correlations with a meaningful life and none was negative. Only 2 of the 37 items, socializing and partying without alcohol, were positively linked to happiness, and some even had a significant negative relationship. The worst was worry. If you think of yourself as a worrier, that seems to be quite a downer. If happiness is about getting what you want, it appears that meaningfulness is about doing things that express yourself. Even just caring about issues of personal identity and self-definition was associated with more meaning, though it was irrelevant, if not outright detrimental to happiness. This might seem almost paradoxical. Happiness is selfish, in the sense that it is about getting what you want and having other people do things that benefit you. And yet the self is more meaning than happiness. Expressing yourself, defining yourself, building a good reputation and other self-oriented activities are more about meaning than happiness. Does all of this really tell us anything about the meaning of life? A yes answer depends on some debatable assumptions, not least the idea that people will tell the truth about whether their lives are meaningful. Another assumption is that we are even capable of giving a true answer. Can we know whether our lives are meaningful? Wouldn't we have to be able to say exactly what that meaning is? Recall that my colleagues and I did not give our study respondents a definition of meaning, and we didn't ask them to define it themselves. We just asked them to rate their level of agreement with statements such as, in general, I consider my life to be meaningful. To look deeper into the meaning of life, it might help to clarify some principles. First of all, what is life? One answer supplies the title to a constellation of vital phenomena. 2013 Anthony Marr's moving novel about Chechnya following the 2 recent wars. A character is stranded in her apartment with nothing to do and starts reading her sister's Soviet-era medical dictionary. It offers little in the way of useful or even comprehensible information, except for its definition of life, which she soon read. Life, a constellation of vital phenomena, organization, irritability, movement, growth, reproduction, adaptation. That, in a sense, is what life means. I should add that we now know it is a special kind of physical process, not atoms or chemicals themselves, but the highly organized dance they perform. The chemicals in a body are pretty much the same from the moment before death to the moment after. Death doesn't alter this or that substance, the entire dynamic state of the system changes. Nonetheless, life is a purely physical reality. The meaning of meaning is more complicated. Words and sentences have meaning, as do lyrics. Is it the same kind of thing in both cases? In one sense, the meaning of life could be a simple dictionary definition, something like the one I gave in the previous paragraph. But that's not what people want when they ask the meaning of life, any more than it would help someone who is suffering from an identity crisis to read the name on their driver's license. One important difference between linguistic meaning and what I'll call the meaningfulness of a human life is that the second seems to entail a value judgment, or a cluster effect, which in turn implies a certain kind of emotion. Your mathematics homework is full of meaning in the sense that it consists entirely of a network of concepts, meanings, in other words. But in most cases there is not much emotion linked to doing sums, and so people tend not to regard it as very meaningful in the sense in which we are interested. In fact, some people love doing mathematics, or have anxiety about it, but those reactions hardly seem conducive to viewing the subject as a source of meaning in life. Questions about life's meaning are really about meaningfulness. We all simply want to know the dictionary definition of our lives, if they have such a thing. We want our lives to have value, to fit into some kind of mental context. Yet these existential concerns do seem to touch on the merely linguistic sense of the word meaning because they invoke understanding and mental associations. It is remarkable how many synonyms for meaningfulness also refer to merely verbal content. We talk, for instance, about the point of life, or its significance, or whether or not it makes sense. If we want to understand the meaning of life, it seems as though we need to grapple with the nature of meaning in this less exalted state. A bear can walk down the hill and get a drink, as can a person, but only a person thinks the words "I'm going to go down and get a drink." Linguistic meaning is a kind of non-physical connection. Two things can be connected physically, for example when they are nailed together, or when one of them exerts a gravitational or magnetic pull on the other. But they can also be connected symbolically. The connection between a flag and the country it represents is not a physical connection, molecule to molecule. It remains the same even if the country and the flag are on opposite sides of the planet, making direct physical connection impossible. The human mind has evolved to use meaning to understand things. This is part of the human way of being social. We talk about what we do and experience. Most of what we know we learn from others, not direct experience. Our very survival depends on learning language, cooperating with others, following moral and legal rules, and so on. Language is the tool with which humans manipulate meaning. Anthropologists love to find exceptions to any rule, but so far they have failed to find any culture that dispenses with language. It is a human universal. But there's an important distinction to make here. Although language as a whole is universal, particular languages are invented. They vary by culture. Meaning is universal too, but we don't invent it. It is discovered. Think back as homework. The symbols are arbitrary human inventions, but the idea expressed by 5 by 8 equals 43 is inherently false, and that's not something that human beings made up or can change. The neuroscientist Michael Gazzaniga, professor of psychology at the University of California, Santa Barbara, coined the term left brain interpreter to refer to a section in one side of the brain that seems almost entirely dedicated to verbalizing everything that happens to it. The left brain interpreter's account is not always correct, as Gazzaniga has demonstrated. People quickly devise an explanation for whatever they do or experience, fudging the details to fit their story. Their mistakes have led Gazzaniga to question whether this process has any value at all, but perhaps his disappointment is colored by the scientist's natural assumption that the purpose of thinking is to figure out the truth. This, after all, is what scientists themselves do. On the contrary, I suggest that a big part of the purpose of thinking is to help one talk to other people. Minds make mistakes, but when we talk about them, other people can spot the errors and correct them. By and large, humankind approaches the truth collectively, by discussing and arguing, rather than by thinking things through alone. Many writers, especially those with experience of meditation and Zen, remark on how the human mind seems to prattle on all day. When you try to meditate, your mind overflows with thoughts, sometimes called the inner monologue. Why does it do this? William James, author of Principles of Psychology, 1890, said that thinking is for doing, but in fact a lot of thinking seems irrelevant to doing. Putting our thoughts into words is, however, vital preparation for communicating those thoughts to other people. Talking is important. It is how the human creature connects to its group and participates in it, and that is how we solve the eternal biological problems of survival and reproduction. Humans evolved minds that chatter all day because chattering aloud is how we survive. Talking requires people to take what they do and put it into words. A bear can down the hill and get a drink, as can a person, but only a person thinks the words "I'm going to go down and get a drink." In fact, the human might not just think those words, but also say them aloud, and then others can come along for the trip, or perhaps offer a warning not to go after all, because someone saw a bear at the waterside. By talking, the human being shares information and connects, which is what we as a species are all about. Studies on children support the idea that the human mind is naturally programmed to put things into words. Children go through stages of saying aloud the names of everything they encounter and of wanting to bestow names on all sorts of individual things, such as shirts, animals, even their own bowel movements. For a time, our little daughter was naming hers after various relatives, seemingly without any animosity or disrespect. Though we encouraged her not to inform the namesakes, this kind of talk is not directly useful for solving problems or any of the familiar pragmatic uses of thinking, but it does help to translate the physical events of one's life into speech so that they can be shared and discussed with others. The human mind evolved to join the collective discourse, the social narrative. Our relentless efforts to make sense of things start small, with individual items and events. Very gradually, we work towards bigger, more integrated frameworks. In a sense, we climb the ladder of meaning from single words and concepts to simple combinations, sentences, and then onto the grand narrative, sweeping visions, or cosmic theories. Democracy provides a revealing example of how we use meaning. It does not exist in nature. Every year, countless human groups conduct elections, but so far none has observed even a single one in any other species. Was democracy invented or discovered? It probably emerged independently in many different places, but the underlying similarities suggest that the idea was out there, ready to be found. The specific decisions for implementing it, how votes are taken, for example, are invented. All the same, it seems as the idea of democracy was just waiting for people to stumble upon it and put it to use. Wondering about the meaning of life indicates that one has climbed a long way up the ladder. To understand the meaning of some newly encountered item, people might ask how it was made, how it got there, or what it is useful for. When they come to the question of life's meaning, similar questions arise. Why or for what purpose was life created? How did this life get here? What is the right or best way to make use of it? It is natural to expect and assume that these questions have answers. A child learns what a banana is. It comes from the store. Before that, from a tree. It's good to eat, which you do buy. Very important. First removing the outer peel to get at the soft, sweet inside. It's natural to assume that life could be understood in the same way. Just figure out, or learn from others, what it's about and what to do with it. Go to school, get a job, get married, have kids? Sure thing. There is, moreover, good reason to want to get all this straight. If you had a banana and failed to understand it, you might not get the benefit of eating it. In the same way, if your life had a purpose and you didn't know it, you might have wasted it. How sad to miss out on the meaning of life, if there is one. Marriage is a good example of how meaning came into the world and increases stability. We begin to see how the notion of the meaning of life is two quite different things together. Life is a physical and chemical process. Meaning is non-physical connection, something that exists in networks of symbols and contexts. Because it is not purely physical, it can leap across great distances to connect through space and time. Remember our findings about the different time frames of happiness and meaning. Happiness can be close to physical reality, because it occurs right here in the present. In an important sense, animals can probably be happy without much in the way of meaning. Meaning, by contrast, links past, present, and future in ways that go beyond physical connection. When modern Jews celebrate Passover, or when Christians celebrate communion by symbolically drinking the blood and eating the flesh of God, their actions are guided by symbolic connections to events in the distant past, indeed, events whose very reality is disputed. The link from the past to the present is not a physical, the way a row of dominoes falls, but rather a mental connection that leaps across the centuries. Questions about life's meaning are prompted by more than mere curiosity or fear of missing out. Meaning is a powerful tool in human life. To understand what that tool is used for, it helps to appreciate something else about life as a process of ongoing change. A living thing might always be in flux, but life cannot be at peace with endless change. Living things yearn for stability, seeking to establish harmonious relationships with their environment. They want to know how to get food, water, and the like. They find or create places where they can rest and be safe. They might keep the same home for years. Life, in other words, is change accompanied by a constant striving to slow or stop the process of change, which leads ultimately to death. If only change could stop, especially at some perfect point. That was the theme of the profound story of Faust's spat with the devil. Faust lost his soul because he could not resist the wish that a wonderful moment would last forever. Such dreams are futile. Life cannot stop changing until it ends. But living things work hard to establish some degree of stability, reducing the chaos of constant change to a somewhat stable status quo. By contrast, meaning is largely fixed. Language is possible only insofar as words have the same meaning for everyone, and the same meaning tomorrow as today. Languages do change, but slowly, somewhat reluctantly. relative stability being essential to their function. Meaning therefore presents itself as an important tool by which the human animal might impose stability on its world. By recognizing the steady rotation of the seasons, people can plan for future years. By establishing enduring property rights, we can develop farms to grow food. Crucially, the human being works with others to impose its meanings. Language has to be shared, for private languages are not real languages. By communicating and working together, we create a predictable, reliable, trustworthy world, one in which you can take the bus or plane to get somewhere, trust that food can be purchased next Tuesday, know you won't have to sleep in rain or snow but can count on a warm, dry bed, and so forth. Marriage is a good example of how meaning pins down the world and increases stability. Most animals mate, and some do so for long periods or even for life, but only humans marry. My colleagues who study close relationships will tell you relationships continue to evolve and change, even after many years of marriage. However, the fact of marriage is constant. You are either married or not, and that does not fluctuate from day to day, even though your feelings and actions toward your spouse might change considerably. Marriage smooths out these bumps and helps to stabilize the relationship. That's one reason that people are more likely to stay together if they are married than if not. Tracking all your feelings toward your romantic partner over time would be difficult, complicated, and probably always incomplete. But knowing when you make a transition from not married to married is easy, as it occurred on a precise occasion that was officially recorded. Meaning is more stable than emotion, and so living things use meaning as part of their never-ending quest for stability. The Austrian psychoanalytic thinker Viktor Frankl, author of Man's Search for Meaning, 1946, tried to update Freudian theory by adding the universal desire for meaningfulness to Freud's other drives. He emphasized a sense of purpose, which is undoubtedly one aspect but perhaps not the full story. My own efforts to understand how people find meaning in life eventually settled on a list of 4 needs for meaning, and in the subsequent list has held up reasonably well. The point of this list is that you will make life meaningful to the extent that you have something that addresses each of these 4 needs. Conversely, people who fail to satisfy one or more of these needs are likely to find less than adequately meaningful. Changes with regard to any of these needs should also affect how meaningful the person finds his or her life. The first need is, indeed, for purpose. Frankl was right, without purpose, lacks meaning. A purpose is a future event or state that lends structure to the present, thus linking different times into a single story. Purposes can be sorted into 2 broad categories. One might strive toward a particular goal, to win a championship, become vice president, or raise healthy children, or toward a condition of fulfillment, happiness, spiritual salvation, financial security, wisdom. People ask what is the meaning of life, as if there is a single answer. Life goals come from 3 sources, so in a sense every human life has 3 basic sources of purpose. One is nature. It built you for a particular purpose, which is to sustain life by surviving and reproducing. Nature doesn't care whether you're happy, much as people wish to be happy. We are descended from people who were good at reproducing and surviving long enough to do so. Nature's purpose for you is not all-encompassing. It doesn't care what you do on a Sunday afternoon as long as you manage to survive and, sooner or later, reproduce. The second source of purpose is culture. Culture tells you what is valuable and important. Some cultures tell you exactly what you are supposed to do. They mark you out for a particular slot: farmer, soldier, mother, etc. Others offer a much wider range of options and put less pressure on you to adopt a particular one, though they certainly reward some choices more than others. That brings us to the third source of goals: your own choices. In modern Western countries in particular, society presents you with a broad range of paths and you decide what to take. For whatever reason, inclination, talent, inertia, high pay, good benefits, you choose one set of goals for yourself, your occupation, for example. You create the meaning of your life, fleshing out the sketch that nature and culture provide. You can even choose to defy it. Many people choose not to reproduce, and some even choose not to survive. Many others resist and rebel at what their God has chosen for them. The second need for meaning is value. This means having a basis for knowing what is right and wrong, good and bad. Good and bad are among the first words children learn. They are some of the earliest and most culturally universal concepts, and among the few words that house pets sometimes acquire. In terms of brain reaction, the feeling that something is good or bad comes very fast, almost immediately after you recognize what it is. Solitary creatures judge good and bad by how they feel upon encountering it. Does it reward them or punish them? Humans, as social beings, can understand good and bad in loftier ways, such as their moral quality. In practice, when it comes to making life meaningful, people need to find values that cast their lives in positive ways, justifying who they are and what they do. Justification is clearly subject to social, consensual judgment, so one needs to have explanations that will satisfy other people in the society, especially the people who enforce the laws. Again, nature makes some values, and culture adds a truckload of it at once. It's not clear whether people can invent their own values, but some do originate from inside the self and become elaborate. People have strong inner desires that shape their reactions. The third need is for efficacy. It's not very satisfying to have goals and values if you can't do anything about them. People like to feel that they can make a difference. Their values have to find expression in their life and work. Or, to look at it the other way around, people have to be able to steer events towards positive outcomes, by their lights, and away from negative ones. The last need is for self-worth. People with meaningful lives typically have some basis for thinking that they are good people, maybe even a little better than certain other people. At a minimum, people want to believe that they are better than they might have been had they chosen or behaved or performed badly. They have earned some degree of respect. The meaning life, then, has four properties. It has purposes that guide actions from present and past into the future, lending it direction. It has values that enable us to judge what is good and bad, and, in particular, that allow us to justify our actions and strivings as good. It is marked by efficacy, in which our actions make a positive contribution towards realizing our goals and values. And it provides a base for regarding ourselves in a positive light, as good and worthy people. People ask what is the meaning of life, as if there is a single answer. There is no one answer. There are thousands of different ones. A life will be meaningful if it finds responses to the four questions of purpose, value, efficacy, and self-worth. It is these questions, not answers, that endure and unify. The rise of the WhatsApp, the New York Times. To hear more audio stories from publishers like the New York Times, download on for iPhone or Android. Pandemic fatigue hits different. You know the feeling. You've been online all day, bouncing between video calls with colleagues and FaceTimes with family, maybe pausing for a quick vinyasa flow. Your eyeballs feel glassy, your brain parched and limbs sluggish. When your workday is finally over, you consider leaving the house but hear the voice of the comedian Elsa Jimbo. It's a pandemic in your head. Instead, you get back online, maybe to listen to a talk, binge a costume drama, play a few hours of Fortnite, look up a dinner recipe or fire up Seesaw to help your kids with their homework. This is the sum of your life now. You're essentially a husk. In sweatpants. Shifting our entire lives indoors this past year has also meant shifting our entire lives online. For a significant part of the population, where we work, where we socialize, where we relax got squeezed into the same two-dimensional space, our screens. The distinction between work and everything else, already a blurry line, most Americans, got even blurrier. Many of us spend a vast majority of our waking hours working, rarely taking breaks for lunch, vacation, or even leave. Before the pandemic, the workday was full of natural pauses like commuting, elevator rides, hallway chats, caffeine runs. Now many of us work for hours straight without even pausing to stand up. We worked at more than our jobs too. 2020 required a crash course in epidemiology, civics, capital, white supremacy, mutual aid, and abolition. The pandemic also ignited an existential crisis for the white-collar worker class. Toiling under global capitalism often means alienation from the product of your labor or, at the very least, the means to shape or control it, and that discovery alone formed its own kind of despair. Among white-collar workers, there was a sense of restlessness, both online, the number of daily active Twitter users 24%, and offline, as households struggled to adapt. Employers scrambled to figure out how to offer support, which essentially meant keeping people working under circumstances in which work was basically possible. Sick workers cost employers $575 billion in 2019 through missing work and showing up tired, unwell, and unfocused in performing at full capacity. That amount most likely increased significantly in 2020. Before the pandemic, corporations already offered employees spas, on-site barbers, snacks and fruits, massages and exercise stipends. In March, these offerings became more plentiful: complimentary ergonomic evaluations, home office equipment, free childcare, free pair, stipends sizable enough to purchase Pelotons and digital personal trainers, professional coaching, teletherapy, meditation apps. The overall amount spent annually on healthcare by corporations numbers in the billions. In 2020, the average budget for well-being programs, splashy add-ons beyond standard healthcare plan, increased from 2019 by nearly 40% to $4.9 million. Mindfulness apps like Calm, Headspace, Fabulous, Root, and Liberate all surged over the past year, downloaded by people in search of reprieve from the crushing anxiety of the virus. Even the mere act of tapping has a narcotic effect. You can hear a thick, sonorous hum of crickets and see a picture of a serene mountain range and peaceful lake. Last April, as the world moved into a global lockdown, more than 2 million people paid $69.99 for an annual subscription to the app, which includes a selection of daily comms, or short talks on things like the beauty of mandalas and de-escalating conflict, breathing exercises and soundscapes with titles like White Noise, Ocean Surf, and Wind and Pines. To date, one of Calm's most popular pieces of content is a 39-minute bedtime story called Dream With Me, read in a sensual, drowsy voice by the British pop star Harry Styles. Released in early July, it immediately crashed the app because people were so eager to listen to it. Alexander Well, the chief strategy officer at Calm, told me that the company's corporate partnership saw 100% growth in the last year, giving access to 10 million new people. The hype around the company secured an additional $75 million in investment from venture capitalists, pushing the company's valuation above $2 billion. Everyone has a mind, and almost everyone has a phone. They're global issues. Well, told me. By Calm's logic, which is shared by many app makers, we will never untether from our devices, using them for labor, connecting, community interactions, outsourcing. Now we reach for them to comfort us when we are anxious, even though they are often the primary source of that anxiety. Nearly 60% of Americans receive health insurance through their workplaces, a dynamic that tightly binds being cared for to being employed. The system solidified in the 1940s, an outgrowth of labor shortages World War II, which forced companies to compete for the remaining eligible work. A wartime freeze on wages meant it was illegal for businesses to dangle outrageous salaries. Instead, they appealed with perks and benefits like healthcare, which were quickly determined to be free from taxation. Europe, in ruin after the war, largely relied on government to deliver healthcare to the masses. Corporate wellness programs emerged in the 1950s to help workers cope with alcoholism and mental health issues, and encourage them to lead more healthful lives, in order to increase productivity and cut back on the costs of medical plans and the number of days people took off from work. They've only grown in the decades since and become more common as a business strategy to placate workers with back rubs and fancy meals. A 2010 Harvard study found that there's a 6-to-1 return on investment for every dollar spent on employee wellness. Medical costs fall $3.27. Costs associated with absenteeism drop a few dollars as well. For companies and corporations, those numbers add up. Healthcare costs are expected to rise because of COVID-related issues, according to several analysts who study health insurance. Employees who participate in corporate wellness programs do report more job satisfaction and higher levels of happiness, but there's as much, if not more, research that suggests that our fixation on our smartphones contributes to headaches, bad posture, depression, and anxiety. Wellness, the way our culture chooses to define it, has become synonymous with productivity and self-optimization. But wellness isn't something that can be downloaded and consumed, even if the constellations of sun-drenched photos on your Instagram feed indicate otherwise. Kelsey Little, a senior manager of brand content for the fundraising platform GoFundMe, hosts a podcast for the company. Her job involves highlighting stories to showcase and promote GoFundMe, including campaigns to create gardens, organize volunteer efforts for the unhoused in Los Angeles, and distribute clean water in Flint, Michigan. During the pandemic, this has meant sifting through thousands of stories about people getting sick, being evicted, and needing money for healthcare, funeral costs, and groceries, among other things. Every year we have wildfire season and hurricane season, and this was worse than that, she told me. There was also the fight for racial justice and equality, and we saw an insane amount of need on the platform. Little has trouble sleeping in normal, but the work during the pandemic ratcheted up her anxiety. I'd be lying awake and thinking about all the things I'd read, she told me. In 2020, GoFundMe added Calm to its suite of wellness benefits, and Lil was an eager adopter. Mandy Moore reads her to sleep regularly. I ask Little if it's hard to use an app to decompress after being online all day. I'm trying to tell my brain, if I'm doing something for my health, it's separate from the rest of my screen time, she replied. Not something we can avoid this year. Little's situation, turning to the same place that is causing the unrest in the first place, is one of the biggest paradoxes of our time. Our attachment to our devices and what we see on them is often the cause of our angst. Endlessly scrolling through Netflix and checking social media notifications is not just a byproduct of boredom. It's a function of design intended to be so persuasive that it feels impossible to stop. Technology is doing more than capturing our attention. It's extracting whatever data it can get from us and monetizing it. Shoshana Zuboff, a social psychologist and professor emerita at Harvard, describes this as surveillance capitalism, the mining of private human experiences for raw behavioral data that can be sold to advertisers eager to anticipate trends in the marketplace. Our dependency on technology has concentrated wealth in America, making San Francisco home to the most billionaires per capita than any other city. Nearly all of them are white, cisgender men. The pay disparities that have long existed in Silicon Valley are growing, reproducing race and class hierarchy that devalue domestic and menial labor and errand work and obfuscating the human cost of increasing our ease in ordering groceries or takeout. This dystopian side's hidden from view, which helps us ignore it and stay enmeshed. Before the pandemic, the grocery delivery app Instacart reportedly hemorrhaged hundreds of millions of dollars and struggled to turn a profit. In March, the company quickly hired 300,000 workers to meet demand at the height of the pandemic. As independent contractors, they were not eligible for health care benefits. The company promised up to 14 paid days if they received a COVID-19 diagnosis or were required to quarantine. Instacart is now valued at more than $17 billion. Many of its workers say they are barely earning minimum wage. The pandemic may have exposed class inequalities, but the technology that caused one group of people to risk their health while others who could afford to sit at home in comfort amplified and enforced those inequalities. Most tech companies have a well-polished party line about how their culture supports their most vulnerable workers. Alice Vishita, head of global benefits at Pinterest, told me the company tries to build an inspired culture for its workers, with a focus on emotional well-being, which it sees reconditioned to lead inspirational lives. During the pandemic, the mood board search engine has offered creative mask-making tutorials and made statements in support of the Black Lives Matter movement. At the company, meanwhile, there was turmoil within. In June, Ifeoma Ozoma and Shimizu Banks, two former black employees, aired reports of racist and sexist treatment and pay inequalities, and in August, Francoise Brouwer, the company's former chief operating officer, sued Pinterest for gender discrimination. The disconnect between the company's outer offerings and inner workings is revealed by dichotomy present across the tech industry, a desire to perform solidarity rather than enact policies that demonstrate. Pinterest didn't admit to any liability in the case of Brouwer, who is white, but paid out a settlement of $22.5 million. Ozoma and Banks reportedly left with a severance of half their annual salary. There's simply no amount of therapy or other corporate wellness perks that can offset the toxicity of racism and sexism in the workplace. In late January, I went, meaning I logged into Zoom at the designated time, to a Dharma talk called How Technology Shapes Us. I was trying to work on the tension of relying on mindfulness mediated through an internet that is oriented toward disrupting. The day opened with a brief sit, maybe 10 minutes. Though I've sat in meditation for much longer periods of time, my brain itched into the electric slide and pretty much whatever else it wanted except dissolve into nothingness. It was impossible to become a pillar of peace while sitting in front of the void of the screen I use for work and entertainment, whose invisible and silent or irresistible. We already walk around with the seed of dissatisfaction, the sense that something could be better, Randama Fernando, a teacher at the Dharma talk, told me later, and the way we should navigate that sense of imperfection is taking